Okay, Erev Tov. So yesterday we started speaking a little bit about meat and milk, based on the pasuk in this week's parsha. So we were talking yesterday about the question of making a zimun. We have different people. Some ate meat, some ate milk. Can they do a zimun together? And we saw the answer was yes. If you have two people who ate meat and one person who ate milk, since in theory the person who ate milk could then go and eat meat and could join in, says the Magen Abraham, they can make the zimun, and the person eating milk has to lead the zimun. We asked, what if one of the others was a Kohen? Normally we'd give precedence to the Kohen to lead. Is that possible? So I just want to share with you the words, the Aruch HaShulchan, who summarizes the whole thing very nicely. And he writes like this. He says, Bazek Shu. Question we mentioned yesterday. Who cares? They're eating meat and they're eating milk. At the end of the day, they're eating bread. That's why you have the zimun. So that they could all eat together. But they could eat one from another in theory. If you could each have from the bread. The bread itself is Maariv. So he says, this is not difficult. The point is, when you have a zimun, that the three are, the language is mitztalfin lezimun. You join together. You're joining together the people who ate, right? If you have different people who are eating by themselves, they don't make a zimun if they're in the, but they're joining together. And he says, Shnaim sheochlin ze basar v'ze gvina muchachim le'echol bepirud. The whole point of the zimun is bringing you together. You're eating together. If two people are eating meat and one's eating milk, so they have to eat separately to some degree. They can't eat from the same table, or they have to have a different mapal, they have to have some sort of barrier, something in between them. So they recognize, and therefore he says, he says, so you'll say, okay, well then, even the one who's eating milk can't join with the ones eating meat. He says, no. So the reason why you can have the zimun together is because the one who's eating milchiks can join in and together with the one who's eating fleishiks. And then he says, "V'da." So what the Magen Abraham said was that dafka, the one who had the milchiks, has to be the one to do the zimun. Says Aruch HaShulchan, Nilali te'en bezek peida kol kach. He says, actually, no, we don't have to be so concerned about this. Midelo pirsha Gemara be'elchin sham shakohen mevalech. What was the source of all of this? Source was the Gemara that said that if you have a Kohen or Kohanim eating with Yisraelim, that they can all make a zimun together, even though the Kohen might be eating food which the Yisraelim are not allowed to eat, so they can't join, but the Kohen can eat with them. So he says, we don't find over there that the Gemara says specifically that the Kohen would have to be the one doing the zimun. So you might say, well, you'd expect, in any event, the Kohen would have to, because of the mitzvah of v'chibato, of honoring the Kohen, and he would have to do it. But he says at the end of the day, he says, we're not, it's the machloket achronim, but he says, we're not concerned about this. He says, at the end of the day, if they're all joining together with the zimun, so any one of them can lead the zimun, and that would be sufficient. So he says, he ends off, says, and kpeda, there's no, we're not worried. The kimdumani shekena minhag. He ends off. He says, I think this is the minhag. This is what people do. So bottom line is, you have people eating together. Some are eating meat and some are eating milk. Obviously, the precautions need to be in place on the table so that one's not going to eat from the other. But they can join together with the zimun, and they can, whoever can, according to Aruch HaShulchan, either one of them can lead and can make the zimun. Okay, so that was one question that came up. Another very interesting contemporary shaila which comes up, I mentioned yesterday, there's all sorts of new appliances and implements and new forms of cooking. Questions come up related to meat and milk and other things with kashrut as well. So a question that's become more and more popular over the past few years is the question of a sous-vide machine, right? And most of you are thinking, so what, right? A sous-vide. So this is for those who've seen it, it's the French, apparently. It means inside vacuum. That's literally what the words mean. And this is what the professional chefs nowadays use. So I'm told. You have a sort of a container, I think it's a glass container, which has water inside. And there's an implement inside that heats all of the water to a specific uniform temperature. And then the food is placed inside a bag. sealed with a vacuum. So you have a vacuum sealed bag where the food goes in. That goes into the water, and that's the way that it's cooked. There are a number of advantages to this. The point is, you can much more easily control the heat and the temperature to which the food is going to cook. It's going to be much more uniform, so you don't need to be as hot as it would be in an oven or something like that. The entire steak or whatever it is going to get cooked to the same. Right? Not everybody. Have you ever tried it? But in any event, so it all gets cooked to a more uniform way and the same temperature. So that is why it's done. So the question is, number of questions get raised with this. If you have one of these machines, if it was used, if you had a non-kosher food that was cooked in it, could you then use it to cook kosher? I'm not going to talk about that now. Questions are also raised in terms of heating up the food, in terms of Shabbat and Yom Tov. A fascinating discussion. But one of the questions is asked regarding meat and milk. And there are two questions here. One is, could you, theoretically, you could have two bags of food in at the same time. Could you have, if one bag is meat and one is milk at the same time? Okay, the answer there is going to be a bit more straightforward. But the more interesting question is, could you use the same sous-vide machine to cook meat first and then to cook milk, one after the other? Maybe whether you change the water or don't change the water, could you use it? So, as you can guess, this is a somewhat new technology, and there are a number of different opinions out there on the matter. But I'll talk you through some of them. So, in terms of the question of whether you could do meat and milk at the same time, that's pretty straightforward, and just about everybody will say no, right? For one of two reasons: either because we know when we look at the when we look at the basic principles of cooking and the basic principles of kashrut, of transfer of taste. So whenever we have two elements, whenever we have heat and we have liquid, then halachically we assume that there's going to be a transfer of taste from one to the other. So if you have a pot on the stove, a pot which has got chicken soup inside, and a drop of milk falls on the outside of that pot, right, or whatever it is, how much has been written there, entire simanim and in the Shulchan Aruch, talking about where the milk lands and how much, and if it's 60 times what's inside or 60 times what's not. But we assume there is heat, there is liquid. We assume there's going to be a transfer of taste. So over here as well, you have, again, the food is inside this bag. It's a sealed, what? It's a vacuum bag, right? I'll get to that in a minute. But in the same way, so there are those who say, wait a minute. In the same way that if I have a pot, the pot is solid on the outside, right? But there's liquid and there's heat. Again, halachically, there's a transfer of taste from one side to the other. So too, there could be, if you have a bag which has got the meat and a bag which has got the milk in the same time, there could be a transfer of taste from one to the other. That is one svara. There are those who say that. There are those who say, wait, if it's vacuum back, does that affect the status? Do we say the fact that this is completely sealed and this is with a vacuum, that means that there's not going to be any transfer of taste? So that is discussed. Like I say, the jury is still out on that, because the question a few years ago, there was an article that was written, there was research that was done in terms of when we talk about avarat time, transfer of taste. You know, scientific. Some people went and did some scientific experiments where they checked different materials and they checked how porous it was and whether it was whether you could taste the particles that went from one to the other, and different rabbanim had different opinions on that. There was, I will say, it's quite a radical opinion, and it's quite probably a minority opinion to come out and say, well, we don't see the taste, scientifically, we don't know where the taste is being transferred. But as I said, these are the principles which Chazal laid down for us. This is the way that we have in our sources, that we assume may not be scientifically, but halachically, there is a transfer of taste, and wherever those conditions are met, so we have to be concerned for it. So, would the fact that it's completely vacuum sealed, would that change things? There are some who say yes, and there are some who say that since it's vacuum sealed, we assume that nothing will transfer at all. But even then, they would say there's actually Shut B'Marau Bazak, B'Meretz Chemda. It's not been published yet, but the 10th volume, which is going to be published at some point, there's a tshuva dealing with this, and there they take the position that since it's completely sealed, vacuum sealed, there's not going to be any transfer from one to the other. But still say to have meat and milk at the same time, that's going to be forbidden, either because not everybody knows how to use it, and not everybody knows how to seal it properly, and it might come out. What? It's not a perfect vacuum, right? So it could be that that. Okay, so not everybody knows how, and it may not be perfect. It may tear. There may be a hole or something, and therefore cooking them together at the same time that is going to be forbidden. There's nobody that I've seen who would say you could use this machine, cook meat and milk at the same time. What about cooking one after the other? Okay, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. So let's assume if we say that it's completely sealed and it's a perfect vacuum, and we take that into account, halachically, there's no transfer of taste at all, so then there wouldn't be a question. Most poskim are not willing to go that far, and most say we have to be concerned there is going to be still some transfer. So we say like this. So we might say that this is a classic case of nat barnat. Maybe nat barnat. I'll explain. Okay, why do I say that? Nat barnat means noten tam bar noten tam. The Gemara talks about this. Where we have the classic case is where you have fish that was cooked or was on a meaty plate, and then you are allowed to eat it afterwards with milk. Okay, the food itself is parav. The food itself that was cooked, let's say parav food that was cooked in a meaty pot, that food afterwards, right? At least certainly b'diavad, after the fact, could be eaten with milky food. Why? Because we say it's what's called nat bar nat. There are two different transfers of taste, right? The first transfer, the first noten time was when you went from I have a pot which became meaty. How did it become meaty? I cooked meat in it. So the taste of the meat that was cooked went into the walls of the pot. That's the first transfer. Then later on, I took the same pot. I now cook something parav in it. So I have the transfer of the taste of the meat from the walls of the pot that now goes into the parav food. So that is nat bar nat. Even though it was cooked in a meaty utensil, that food itself remains parav. Okay, there's a difference of opinion. Ashkenazim and Sfardim, if in the first instance, if I know, can I cook it in a meat pot in order to eat it with milk? Okay, it gets very complicated. I'm not going to go into the discussion now. But certainly what everybody agrees is that b'diavad, and certainly if we have three transfers of taste, if we have nat, bar nat, right? So I just gave you an example where there are two transfers. If there's a third transfer, that's going to remain completely parav. I'm not going to accept it. So if we have this sous-vide machine, so you might say the following. Let's count how many transfers of taste there are. Let's say first we cook with the meat. So you have from the meat into the bag is the first noten time. And then from the bag into the water is the second. And then from the water into the given the machine, that is the third. So that's already nat bar nat. Now, even if it's the same, well, let's say we change the water, we're now going to cook again with the milk. Even if you're going to say you've got the taste from the machine into the water, into the bag, so nat bar nat, and that would be permitted, right? And therefore, according to that, if that's correct, we would say there would be no problem using the same machine from milchik and then later on for fleishik, or other way around. What's the problem? What's the catch? Catch is the classic case of nat bar nat is what I described before, where on one occasion I have the pot, right, and the taste goes from the meat into the pot. Later on, it's been washed out, it's been cleaned out, but the taste is still there. And now I cook again, and now that's when the second transfer takes place from the pot into the food. It's not all taking place at the same time, right? In the case that I just gave with the sous-vide machine, to say that nat bar nat, what did I say? I said from the meat into the bag, into the water, into the machine. That's all taking place at once. That's all. That's not nat. So there are those who say that's not nat bar nat. That's just cooking. That's just the one time. So that would be fleishik. And if I accept that, then we may have a problem. We may not. Then we may have to assume that the machine is fleishik, and without kashering it or doing something else, I would not be able to use the milchik. Okay, those are two different ways of looking at it. There's more to talk about, but I'd come for today. Don't change the water.